Hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from newspolitics.com. Welcome to the second day of our second annual Midwest Polling Summit. Yesterday, we had a really good session, and all the attendees will receive a link to the video as well as links to the AARP polling and the Pew polling that came out last night. Before I get to the program, I wanted to talk about some upcoming programs too. October 15th, that's next week, Thursday, we have state Senate leaders talking about the top state Senate races. On the following Thursday, October 22nd, for DC audiences and others, we have a look at the presidential race of what might come after in Congress from a member of the an RNC committee man from Wisconsin, two DNC representatives from Wisconsin, and the political director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But want to get to this program. Again, welcome. The format is I ask some questions, and then you get to ask some questions through the chat function. So if you haven't submitted a question, you're welcome to go to the Q&A at the bottom and to type in a question. So before we get started, we want to go to our sponsors. This two-day event could not have happened without them. So first, I want to thank the Outrider Foundation, and here to say a few words about the Outrider Foundation is Tia Nelson. Hi, Tia.
Hi, good afternoon, Jeff. I'm in DC at Mom's house, and I want to thank you and WisPolitics and all the other panelists for being a part of this important discussion. I am Managing Director for Climate Change at the Outrider Foundation, where we work to inform and engage the public on the risks facing all of humanity posed by nuclear weapons and climate change. We seek to build bridges and help people see themselves as being a part of a solution to these big challenges. And if you go to our website, outrider.org, you can find out more about these issues, who we are, how we work, and just grateful to be able to be with you today. And so, thanks.
And thank you, Tia. Really appreciate it. And now on to our other sponsor for this two-day event. Again, couldn't have done it without these sponsors. We have Sam Wilson from AARP, Wisconsin. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. It's our honor to be one of the co-sponsors of WisPolitics.com's second annual Midwest Polling Summit. Yesterday on day one was certainly fantastic and a lot of great information. I know day two will be the same. AARP has almost a 40-year history of nonpartisan voter engagement and education activities, and 2020, I dare say, is no different, although we know everything is different about 2020. We started a campaign back in August called Protect Voters 50+, which is really focused on two things: ensure people understand the different ways that they can vote safely this election, and also to highlight the issues of importance to the 50+ population. If people would like information about those activities of AARP here in Wisconsin, they can go to aarp.org/WIvotes. That's aarp.org/WIvotes, or they can see our most recent polling at aarp.org/WIpoll, which we released yesterday here. So really excited, Jeff, to hear these preeminent voices from Wisconsin, or talking about Wisconsin politics. I'm hoping to have a little bit more clarity in my own crystal ball based on theirs, and perhaps more importantly, have a little nugget of information so I can win all those friendly wagers that I'm making with my friends and family outside of Wisconsin. So that needs to be my big takeaway today, Jeff.
Okay, well, this is like an odds makers event then. All right, well, thank you. All right, well, we're going to go to the program now. I want to introduce our all-star panel, and it really is an all-star panel, and I thank all of you for being part of it. Emily Swanson is the Director of Public Opinion Research for the Associated Press. Sarah Simmons is of Purple Strategies, a polling expert who's advised various Republican campaigns and hails from Wisconsin. Barry Burton, he's the Director of the UW-Madison Elections Research Center. Ray Block, he's Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Department of African American Studies at Penn State, and author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. And Ray was with us last year, did a great job. And I think his book can shed insight onto what's going on all through the upper Midwest. And then we have, of course, Charles Franklin. He's director of the Marquette University Law School poll. And just going to point out that Ray and Emily are part of the Charles Franklin Alumni Association. But as Charles said, they've achieved all of that on their own. So anyway, I just want to start off with just get your assessment on what the state of the race is, and in Wisconsin and the nation. And so I'm just going to go to you, Emily, first, because I think you have the national perspective, certainly being with the Associated Press and directing public opinion research. What's the state of the race?
So, I mean, I think it's very fair to say that right now, you would rather be Joe Biden than you would to be Donald Trump in terms of where things stand in the polls right now. And that includes both nationally and in many of the states that we're going to be talking about today, including Wisconsin. I do have some flashbacks seeing some of the polls right now, including, the CNN poll last week with Biden up 16, my own final poll in 2016, which was several weeks before the election, but had Hillary Clinton up 14. So I do think that it seems like there has been a little bit more stability, fewer moments of polls starting to come back together, which sort of, it seems like perhaps there's a little bit of that, less of that tendency happening, but yeah, I am feeling occasionally some feelings of deja vu, and wouldn't want to say that anything is over yet.
Okay, fair enough. Sarah, what's your view on the state of the race?
Well, I think it's fair to say there's, the number of October surprises we've had so far leaves a lot in chaos. But, I did a quick poll of the pollsters over the last few days and talked to people on both sides of the aisle. And I think the common threads that I'm hearing are a real collapse for Trump with suburban women. I mean, that was never the strong suit, but, the rage of moms in minivans trying to, keep their houses clean, their professional life on track. And, now many are also doing homeschooling. I think that that's a real thing. And seeing sort of the Trump reaction to COVID over the past few days is really significant. And I got an email this morning from a Republican pollster friend that just said, total collapse. He was trying to hold the line when we talked earlier in the week, and he just said, no, it's really bad. I think there's a big unknown though. And I know this is doing less political work now and more on the corporate side, but just tactically trying to get samples right in this time and space is very, very challenging. And I think trying to get non-college educated white men, especially, to answer the phone, to respond to an online survey, to engage in the ways that we've traditionally collected data is incredibly difficult. And those people are holdouts for Trump. And I think that Emily's, that nervous churn in her stomach, I'm having as well, not knowing if those people are being captured adequately. And I think that's a lot of what we saw last cycle as well. And that's a real challenge moving forward.
Okay, let's go to Professor Ray Block from Penn State. Ray, what's your sense of the state of the race?
So I was humbled in 2016. I will start with that, right? One of the things that the work that I've been doing with African-American voters, and I doubt that it's only specific to African-American voters, has got me rethinking what it means to be a swing voter, for example. We typically think of a swing voter as a voter that could go to the GOP or that could go to the Democratic Party in terms of preference. But the thing that keeps sticking out to me, at least with some of the data that I would be showing if I were doing a presentation right now, is that the swing might not necessarily be between the candidates, but it might be between not going out to vote at all and any candidate. We're seeing a lot of that with the African-American centered polling that we're doing, and conversations about the legitimacy of the upcoming election only make me more nervous about the influence of not voting in this case, as opposed to me thinking about candidate preference. And so I've been really thinking a lot about what we're going to learn in November about the ability for narratives about the illegitimacy of the election and their influence on turnout, if there's going to be any influence on turnout.
Okay, well, we'll come back to all those elements. Thank you very much. Okay, Professor Barry Burton from UW-Madison's Election Research Center. What's the state of the race, Barry?
Well, I think Biden is in a very strong position. There's no guarantee, as the other panelists were saying, things are moving, and this is about the time when the polls really begin to solidify and make their final shifts, just as the debates are happening in early October. But as Joe Biden's lead is durable enough, it's stable, it's very consistent from the national polls, which were right on 4 years ago, and the state polls. And that's a real difference from 4 years ago, where the state and national polls were telling different stories. This year, they're more consistent and just rock solid, despite all the things that have happened this year. The other thing I would note is that Biden's lead began a year ago, or whenever pollsters first began to ask the head-to-head race between Biden and Trump. So Biden was ahead from the outset, before he was the nominee, before the pandemic hit, before impeachment had been wrapped up, before any of the stuff that had taken place this summer, conventions, running mates, all of that. So I think there was a built-in majority ready to vote against Trump. Now that may soften, but we have to remember he didn't win the popular vote, and his victories in Wisconsin and other places depended on some votes going to third parties and independent candidates. That third party vote is really going to be squished down to a very small number this time around. And I think that presents some challenges for Trump. So not impossible that Trump could claw back and pull this together, but I think right now it's difficult to see what that path is.
Right, but Barry, I think we should point out that the UW-Madison Elections Research Center did polling on its own this year. And when was your last poll? What did it show? And when's your next poll?
Yeah, so the Elections Research Center surveys are a little different than some of the other surveys you'll hear about today, in that it's a panel study interviewing the same people over time. We began with them back in February in 3 states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We think those are important states in the Electoral College, given what happened 4 years ago. The last survey was just a couple weeks ago in late September, and it showed among likely voters, Biden ahead by 4 in Wisconsin, 4 in Pennsylvania, 6 in Michigan. And because we'd re-interviewed those folks from August, so just around the time of the conventions, we could see how much movement there was at the individual level. And it's close to zero. People who were Biden voters, even back in our first survey in February, are still mostly Biden voters. And same on Trump's side. To the degree that there's movement, it's independents wiggling around a little bit, and maybe they've shaded a little bit back towards Biden after the conventions and the latest news, but also the third party and non-voters from 2016 who are now very much on Biden's side. They are really making the difference this year.
So is there going to be another one coming out this month?
Yeah, there'll be one more in October. This will be our final look. Should drop just 10 days or so before the election.
Right, and people can find that stuff where?
They can visit our website, which is elections.wisc.edu, or follow the Elections Research Center on Twitter or Facebook at Elections Center.
Great. All right, now on to Charles Franklin. And Charles, as a favor to you, we did a slide because I know you love slides. So David's going to put up a slide. Anyway, results came out yesterday from your most recent poll. And I did this on my own. I picked which ones I thought would be interesting, but you don't necessarily have to talk about what I have up there. But anyway, what's the state of the race from what you saw in your poll that just came out?
Yeah, I think I'll echo what everybody else has said in terms of the stability of the race. So we have Biden up by 5 points in this poll among likely voters. But if you go back over the summer, in May, it was 4 points, then 6, then 5, then 4, now 5 again. So we've seen very little shift in that. On favorability, there's been a little bit of a change. Trump's favorability dropped in the late spring as the COVID epidemic hit and then the economic impact hit. And he's running, as you see here, about a -11 net on that. Slightly better, he was at a -13, then -12, and now -11. But Biden is in this latest poll for the first time above water on favorability, a +3. That's up from a -2 a month ago and a bit lower than -2 in months preceding. So one contrast with 2016 at this point is that Biden's net negatives were never as deeply negative as Clinton's were, but we've also seen this modest trend in his direction. And for the first time this month, that crossover into positive territory. On the method of voting that I see on the slide, we also have seen over the course of the spring from April and May till now, a bit of a decline in the percentage of people who say they want to vote or expect to vote absentee by mail. Republicans dropped off early on that, but Democrats have moved down on it over the course of the summer. I think the uncertainties about the postal system are certainly part of that. This current estimate that you see on the screen of 32% absentee by mail is, I think, a pretty solid estimate. If you look at the number of absentee ballots that the Wisconsin Elections Commission lists as having been requested, you'd get an estimate that looks more like maybe 36 or 38% of the election will be absentee by mail. But that's a good deal less than the 60% that we had in the rather chaotic spring primary in April. So I think there's a plausible agreement here that we'll see absentee rates in the mid-30s to maybe the high 30s, but that's not going to reach the 60% level we saw in the April spring election.
Charles, I'm just going to stay with you and ask this. Voter engagement seems very high. All the polling seems to show that. I mean, there's a lot of messaging coming through every device in every way. So I guess, are you looking for a record turnout?
I think so, based on the percentage of people who say they're absolutely certain they're going to vote, and based on the percentage that say they're very excited about voting in this fall's election. I think we will end up with about 3.1 million total turnout. We've been over 3 million before, but we've never hit 3.1, I believe. Registration has been rising over the course of the year, though perhaps not into astronomically high levels, but it is very solid. And so let's say 3.1. That would be, as I say, record territory. I'd be surprised if we fall a lot short of that, but I'd be very surprised if we go over that too.
Okay, Sarah, you mentioned this about the October surprises. My joke was, it's October 9th and we've had 5 October surprises already. Do you think, Charles has talked about how dug in voters seem to be, via the polling. Is there an October surprise that can even move the needle at this point?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to that I feel strongly about. I will say this. I think there's a lot to be said about people solidifying behind their particular candidate. And I think Barry pointed out even sort of that lead that has been consistent over time. I think that's a real challenge for both candidates in this election. I mean, what are you going to hear about Joe Biden that you don't already know? What are you going to hear about Donald Trump that you don't already know? Although I think Donald Trump is doing his best to introduce some new things into the, I wonder if I were advising him as a candidate, if I wouldn't have told him, take the COVID break, go let Joe be Joe for 10 days. Because I think every Democrat I know says he did his best over the summer when he hid in the basement, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for him. So I wonder, how those dynamics play out. I also think, we can safely say that the Trump campaign is having some really significant challenges with, a lot of their top brass really sick and having to quarantine or isolate as they recover from COVID. Having, been at that level of a presidential campaign, you're working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I'm not sure. I wonder how that's all playing out. I'm sure there's chaos there that's contributing. What other October surprise could you have? I'd also say, as we're talking, as Charles was talking about turnout and how people are voting and methodologies, I mean, how many millions? I think the number I saw this morning was something like, 6 million ballots have already been cast, probably many more than that, we haven't shown up, through the mail system yet. So I wonder about the ability to actually execute an October surprise that would have any impact. I also don't write anything out in the current chaotic environment.
Okay, I want to go to Emily Swanson of the Associated Press. There just seem to be so few undecideds this year, and not as many places to go, if you will, in the third party category. And the rules, the rule used to be that the incumbent, if you don't have the undecideds by now, they're not going to you, they're going to break to the challenger. If Hillary Clinton was the virtual incumbent in 2016 and then they broke away from her, will we see that happening this time around with Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, an interesting question for Trump is whether he can sort of replicate some of what he did in 2016 in terms of reminding some of those voters who did end up holding their noses for him in 2016, that what they really want is a Republican, and he's the Republican, which is, I think, his very best hope. And it was a big part of what ended up saving him in 2016. The Supreme Court battle has given him a little bit of an opening there to remind folks who are part of his base of why you want to elect a Republican. But even more so than in 2016, when he was obviously a huge piece of the public eye, and I don't think there were necessarily a lot of voters late in the campaign who didn't have a pretty good idea who Trump was, but it is different to be the sitting president and to have been this much a part of public life for 4 years. I don't necessarily think it's impossible. The depth of unpopularity that he won in spite of in 2016 was unprecedented. This also, I think, would be fairly unprecedented, but he could hypothetically thread the needle. It's more of a challenge both against somebody who, Joe Biden is not the incumbent, of course, but also as Charles already mentioned, doesn't face the same depth of unpopularity. I think it's different when there are two deeply unpopular candidates versus one deeply unpopular candidate and one who maybe there are some voters who feel a little, meh about, but it is a different dynamic than the one that he faced in 2016, which makes that a much greater challenge.
Barry Burton, director of the UW-Madison Elections Research Center. Barry, I wanted to, Emily just mentioned about the Supreme Court appointment and the hearings that are going to take place. This calls for speculation, but I know you can speculate. What effect are those hearings going to have, do you think, on driving voters from either side or both sides?
Well, it does complicate things. In our last survey in mid-September, which was done before Ginsburg's death, we asked voters what the most important issue was to them. And I think there were 11 issues, and the Supreme Court was about 10th out of 11, not high on people's radar screen. And even if you add in issues that you might think are connected to the Supreme Court, like abortion, that was also in the single digits. So people are really focused on the pandemic, the economy, climate change, and other kinds of things. That's obviously changed since the opening and the nomination, but that too has been derailed by other news, by Trump's contracting the virus and everything else that has happened on an hourly basis since then. I think it probably affects Senate races more than it affects the presidential race. There are some really key Senate races where senators' party labels are out of step with what's happened with their states, and this may cause those things to sort of snap together. I'm thinking of cases like Cory Gardner in Colorado, who's a Republican in a state that's increasingly blue. The fact that the Supreme Court's on the table probably hurts him further. But it might help someone like Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, who's in a tough race, but is chairing the Judiciary Committee. He's in a Trump state. That may help him out. I think at the presidential level, there are just so many other things going on that the Supreme Court is going to remain a kind of low level factor. Not that it won't matter in the end, and if it's a close race, everything matters. But right now it looks to me like not the giant issue that we might have suspected.
But it did have a big effect on fundraising, I think, especially in these Senate races.
Yeah,
and so
I'd interject that I think for a lot of conservative voters, and I hear this, listen, I'm not in the Trump camp at all. Probably wouldn't be allowed in the door. But I would say for a lot of the conservatives I know who are saying we're sticking with Trump despite all of this, it is about abortion, and it is about the Supreme Court, and it is about those issues that are more longstanding, that go beyond what they see in the immediate with the economy and COVID. So I do think, those pro-life voters are very energized by what's going on with the court. I also think for the Senate, I think that, that is the down ballot trick. Like, how do you keep them engaged and try to get that done before Election Day? I think that's going to be really challenging. I think, especially now that you see, COVID's hitting people in the Senate, I think ultimately it's going to be like, there's a snowball effect of that going down the train tracks. Second thing that I think is really critical, and I've been thinking about, is, the Pope's statement about don't be a single issue voter, I think is really interesting to Catholic pro-life voters. I think especially in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, where there's big blocks of Catholic voters. Similarly, sort of the Regeneron conversation, that's, I think, rather fringe conversation at the moment, but certainly has the ability to sort of amp up energy around, wow, he took this drug that was derived of like fetal tissue. I don't know how many people are going to clue into that, but I think all these things sort of attack a thread where I think Donald Trump had a pretty weak connection already on more, sort of the moral ground. And I'm not sure how people rectify that or how that plays out when people are really sitting there at the last moment.
Yeah, we talked yesterday and with the Pew Research's Carroll Doherty about the Catholic swing vote, so to speak. They've always been a swing vote, but he was saying that it was, white Catholics have really gravitated to the Republican side, and so that makes the Amy Coney Barrett appointment sort of a obvious play to those voters. I think, right, Sarah?
Yeah, I think completely. And I think he's being guided certainly in his administration by some of the, more involved thinkers around conservative judicial philosophy. And I think that that's really playing out in all of his appointments, but certainly with her appointment. I just think it's been distracted. So I don't think that message has been delivered necessarily as cleanly as you would have wanted it to if you were running that campaign.
Okay, now I want to go back to Ray Block. And Ray, you were author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. I wonder whether, you spent a lot of time in Wisconsin, and whether you see any parallels, about this polarization, racial polarization here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so it's always hard to compare states to states, but the dynamics to me draw a lot of parallels. And so in Tennessee, as far as a southern state can be up for grabs in terms of partisanship, where you had to work to get it. And during the early 2000s, which is the time frame for our book, we saw that dynamic completely and utterly change. And it changed in different and unique ways. So it was more than just representation in the Tennessee General Assembly, because that switched over and the Republicans had a supermajority. But with that Republican supermajority, we saw trickling down these changes in policy preferences and changes in the way voters interacted with politics. And those changes happened to cross over in terms of racial divisions and in terms of socioeconomic status divisions in the state. And so the reddening of Tennessee, we argue, taught us a lot about what was happening in places like that in America, places that didn't necessarily have a history of being locked in for one political party, which is what Wisconsin was before I moved there. I feel like I brought bad luck in the state. So like the joke that I run with is that I was in Florida during the 2008 election. And then I was in La Crosse, Wisconsin by the time 2010 happened, right? And so insofar as we observed this reddening of what was not traditionally considered to be a red state, I believe a lot of those conversations come into play when we're thinking about what happens across the country. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that TennCare, which was the state's Medicaid experimental program, draws a lot of parallels to the Affordable Care Act. And battles currently going on to get rid of the Affordable Care Act resemble some of the arguments that we saw in our book while looking at what was happening to dismantle. Well, there was really reform, but reform meant dismantle in this case, what was happening with TennCare. And so I keep going back to this because I keep thinking about the polarization. And one of the things that strikes me right now is that what we had observed was that there was always racial polarization in Tennessee. The ability to mobilize around that racial polarization is what we saw as a dynamic entity in our book. And I'm really fascinated with the polarization of racial issues. And that's been happening since forever, obviously. It took on a different flavor with the election of Donald Trump. And we're watching this take place in a very interesting way during the 2016 election. I'm sorry, during the 2020 election. And what's interesting to me is that opinions are starting to shift when it comes to what I'm going to call race relations attitudes. And a lot of polling data has been showing this. And a lot of the more obvious shifts are taking place when it comes to how people think about police reform. And insofar as there are protests still going on right now about police reform, I am curious to see what the polling numbers are going to be looking like after we get the results of this election when it comes to what we're going to do about race relations in general and how they look when it comes to police reform in particular.
Ray, before I want to ask Charles about what you just said there, but before that, I guess I wanted to go back to what you said at the beginning. So were you saying, and I don't want to, I'm interpreting what you said there at the beginning when I asked what the landscape was, that you're worried about the African-American vote being suppressed through various means, or did I miss that?
I don't even think it has to be suppression as much as it has to be I'm just worried about the concerns about being able to vote being enough to keep people that would likely not vote anyway, unmotivated enough to actually cast ballots. And so rumors of suppression might actually work as well as actual acts of suppression when the general arguments that are floating around in the air is that we can't trust the results of the election. And right now, like one of the jokes colleagues are making around me is that election night will most likely be an election fortnight. And the amount of questions that are going to be drawn when it comes to figuring out what the exact ballot count is going to be are the sort of things that people are predicting already. And those kinds of things can be a wet blanket on folks that are already suspicious about voting in the first place. And like I say, those things don't actually have to happen as much as they just have to be a concern. And the concern could be enough to actually motivate behaviors or not motivate behaviors in that case.
Okay. To Charles Franklin now of the Marquette poll. Charles, what sort of movement have you seen on protests, Black Lives Matter, or these racial attitudes that Ray was talking about?
Yeah, I think those are very interesting questions and how they shift over time. What we saw in June was a real surge in sympathy and support for the Black Lives Matter movement and for the protests. We saw 61% approval of the protests in June, 59% favorability to Black Lives Matter. Big majorities in both of those cases. But then over the summer to early August, before the events in Kenosha occurred, we saw those numbers drop off to a 48-48 even split on protests. Black Lives Matter remained net positive, but also fell off from the high 50s into the high 40s of favorability. Both of those numbers have been pretty stable since then. The events in Kenosha didn't seem to change attitudes very much. It was more likely that the continuing protests in June and July, the president's position on protests and branding protests in various ways as criminal or whatever, realigned people in that period, but not further. I think on the policy issue of police reform, we're looking at an area that's very complicated. When you, in our polling, ask, do you favor defunding the police? That's 20% support. But do you favor reforming the police and making them more accountable? That's 80% support. That's a huge gulf between those two, depending on how you word the question and what it means to people. And neither of those is well defined in what it means. There's no specificity to reform and accountable, and there's also no specificity about what exactly defunding looks like. I think the other bigger policy issue that we certainly see in Wisconsin, maybe even more so than you see nationally, is in Wisconsin a real reluctance to see the police as broadly responsible for the deaths of Black people in their custody. It's barely an even split in Wisconsin who say, whether it's George Floyd or Jacob Blake, that those are isolated incidents. Are about 47% say that, and about 47% say they're part of a broader problem. Nationally, broader problem is up around 60 to 70%. So Wisconsinites in particular are very reluctant to put this blame on the police system and broader problems, and just see it as a case-by-case basis. This is where we have a legal system that provides strong protections for police in their conduct, which makes it very hard for grand juries or prosecutors to charge them with crimes, even when the conduct seems to the lay observer to be egregious. And as a result, we're continually seeing this divide between people who think their grievances are not addressed and the legal system that says, nope, this is conduct that's protected by the law. So I think those are huge problems for us going forward. And when you look at a state like Wisconsin, where voters as a whole give the police over an 80% favorability rating, you can see why it's so difficult to get juries to act in either charges or convictions of police misconduct over and beyond the fact that the law is awfully favorable to the police in those situations. So what do we do on a policy level? What do we actually accomplish in laws is fraught, and I think we'll see it slowly develop over the next few years.
So Barry Burton from UW-Madison, what have you seen in your polling that might relate to the race relations or the fallout from the protests?
Well, our surveys have asked fewer questions about policing and the kinds of attitudes that Charles was discussing, but we did ask whether people were satisfied with how President Trump has handled the protests after George Floyd's death. And the public in Wisconsin and the other two states is pretty negative on that measure. But as Charles says, there's a complicated set of attitudes about police and race beneath that. But I will say one other thing that I think connects to Ray's point about racial polarization. Compared to other swing states, Wisconsin has a smaller non-white population than, say, Ohio or Pennsylvania or Florida, but nonetheless remains a competitive state. In our surveys, and I think in the latest Marquette poll, the number of Republicans and Democrats, people who call themselves Republicans and Democrats, is almost exactly even among likely voters. There's just a few respondents difference. And so the battle is really about turnout of those groups and loyalty of those groups, and then obviously what happens to independents. And that's different from, say, the race in Pennsylvania, another key swing state where there's a larger non-white population. And it is, especially African Americans in places like Philadelphia, that help tilt the balance towards the Democrats there when it goes blue. And it means that the white population is a little more Republican than the white population in Wisconsin. And I think Craig Gilbert has written about the difference between Wisconsin and Ohio on that score, that the white population here is a bit more progressive than whites in Ohio. So these are states that are all purple, but for different reasons. Some of it demographic and some of it about the positions of the white majority.
Yeah, Emily Swanson from the Associated Press. What have you seen anything, any threads that might be interesting from your research?
Yeah, we've had similar findings in our own polling to what Charles just talked about in Wisconsin on a national level in terms of in June, we saw huge jumps in some questions that we've been tracking over the course of the past 5 years. Seriousness of the issue of violence committed by the police, feelings that police who commit acts of violence are treated too leniently. And there was this moment of about as close as we come to national unity on this issue back in June, where there were a couple of groups that really drove the shift. Of course, African Americans who are experiencing a lot of this themselves and have been for years, those feelings remained high, but among white Democrats and to a certain extent among Republicans, there was this shift in views on those, and it did start to become more partisan again in our most recent poll, which I think was in September. I'm sort of starting to lose track of time. It's maybe more. Some of you can know the feeling, but it was interesting among white Democrats. Some of that shift remained, but among Republicans, it shifted back to where it was in 2015. So you did see that the polarization that has become such a huge part of pretty much every aspect of American life kind of setting in. And it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, but it was coming as the president was ramping up rhetoric about the violence of protests. And similarly, just like Charles said, in Wisconsin, we also saw rising disapproval of the protest movements, especially among Republicans in that poll.
Sarah, no group votes all just because they're a member of a certain demographic. In fact, and I think the Trump campaign and Republicans in general have been making appeals to Latinos and to Blacks. In fact, there's an ad, I saw an ad recently about, from the Trump campaign about, how Black employment rose, before the pandemic. So, what do you see in sort of attitudes of, or what have you been told in terms of attitudes of minority groups toward Trump?
Yeah, one Republican pollster said, well, he'll do better with both than Romney did, but Romney was running against the first African-American president, in our nation. So a little bit, optimistic talk, knowing that I was going to be in a panel that I think someone was hoping to pull through. I think it's really hard to imagine. And, I know just anecdotally from my friends who've been very involved on the Republican side doing outreach, over time, maybe not currently doing it, but that there's just a real fall off in energy there. So I think the question is more what Ray was getting at. Are people going to feel confident that they can go out and vote safely, that there's not going to be any sort of backlash that's going to happen as they vote? Or is their vote going to be counted if they do it, remotely? To me, those are much bigger issues in what will determine, African-American percentages. It's really more of the math problem, how many turn out versus I would find it pretty hard to believe that Trump is turning out new Latino voters, or that tons of African Americans are suddenly, turning tides and saying, "You're right, he created a bunch of jobs for the African American community." I just don't buy that when a third of our economy has disappeared, and people are really. I think people in those communities are suffering. Probably disproportionately, even with schools. Most of the big city schools, those are the kids who are really having to do things online, and in communities where they might be challenged to get Wi-Fi, right? I just think it's a much different proposition than, telling us that there's whatever percentage of increase in jobs in that community.
So I want to go to a couple audience questions. One of them is, in this tie, I'm going to hook these two questions together. One question is, how strong is the rural-urban divide? And can farmers really be for Trump just because of the new NAFTA? Is there anybody, you could just raise your hand there if you want to sort of weigh in on the rural-urban divide in Wisconsin and elsewhere. All right, Charles, go ahead.
Well, I've got that because I've been asking if you're a farmer or not for the last 9 months. So it's not a big share, but when you pool all the farmers together over all those polls, we've got about 700 or 800 farmers in the sample now. So it's enough to say something about. And the takeaway is, number one, really not that surprising. Farmers are very Republican. Okay. And so in party identification, they lean strongly Republican. But when you compare Republican farmers with Republican non-farmers, there's no difference in the way they view Trump or vote. And when you compare Democratic farmers with Democrats who are not farmers, there's almost no difference. They don't like Trump very much at all, and they're not voting for him. The bottom line then is it's not being a farmer, it's the partisanship that's driving the choice. And it is a little surprising when you think of both the pros and the cons of Trump's farm policy, with providing subsidies and special programs, I guess, to farmers to help them in problems, also the trade deals and so on. But the disruptions to the farm economy, and in Wisconsin, where we've been leading the country in farm bankruptcies. But the takeaway for me in asking this question since last September is that we just don't see any evidence that being a farmer has an independent effect on vote or perceptions of Trump that aren't fully accounted for by partisanship.
Yeah, okay. Now let me ask something about climate change and the environment. Is that causing a ripple at all in the race, do you think? Who wants to weigh in on that one? Barry or Emily?
Sure, I can take that on. You know, it's kind of remarkable in a year in which we've had these huge and lasting fires in the West, along with a really bad hurricane season that is not over yet, and you know, there's another hurricane about to buffet Louisiana tonight, I think, and that it's been so far down as part of the discussion. The fact that the coronavirus has become such a big part of the conversation, and the economic ripple effect has become such a big part of the conversation has, I think, kind of taken some of the air out of the room as far as pretty much any other issue goes. We do see definitely in some of our past polling, for example, in 2018 in AP Votecast, which is our big election survey, we asked people what their top issue in the election was from a list of 9, and the environment fell fairly low on the list, but it actually, that overall number did hide a little bit of the importance of that issue among Democrats in particular. It fell, I think, 3rd or 4th on the list among Democrats, even though I think it was only about 6% who said that was their most important issue overall. There is a subset of voters for whom this is a very important issue, and certainly if you're a voter in the West, in particular, who's been impacted by the fires, not just this year, but in the past, I certainly would imagine that it's impacting the way that you think about the world, the country, your vote. But nationally, I do think that it's fallen short of COVID and of the economy, just because of the magnitude of those issues for Americans as a whole.
Yeah, and I just echo, I don't think Trump has, I mean, from a policy perspective, he hasn't pushed on that. It's not something Republicans care about. And it's like, you know, in light of so many other things, I think, you know, Kamala Harris in her debate performance the other night, I think was very much following a strategy that the thing that matters is COVID and how they've reacted to COVID, that is the driver that is dividing people, especially like post-debate. I think that's what's ginning up energy. That's what's driving, 8 to 16 points, right, on the national surveys. So the notion that you're going to move anybody, I think on climate change is, that's just probably not strategically where any campaign's headed.
But maybe I'll just add that at least on the Democratic side, climate could be a mobilizing issue for some younger Democratic voters.
Totally.
In our survey, I was surprised to see that among Biden voters, the pandemic was by far the #1 issue, but #2 was climate change. Now, it was a big step down, but still it's #2 and it's ahead of other things like guns or foreign affairs or other kinds of issues. So I think bringing on those Sanders type folks into the party and keeping them loyal and having them turn out might rely on that message. We did see Pence in the debate bring up the Green New Deal 3 or 4 times as a criticism of Kamala Harris and of Democrats, fracking and other kinds of environmental issues. So there's some message there. It seems like it's just not sticking. So maybe it works a little bit to the Dems' advantage here.
I think one of the things I've been saying to, Democrats who are asking me what I think is like, what I think the Democrats, one of the Achilles heels that Democrats have is when they feel like things are going great, they often reach too far, right? So I think there's an example in Virginia when a few years ago, it was Democrat governor and they won both houses of the legislature. All of a sudden, the first thing they went out with was late-term abortion. And you're like, wow, as people in the middle, like that's not where they're thinking. So I think Green New Deal is another example of that. Like, gosh, we're feeling good, we're feeling strong. Let's go ahead and go for this thing. And, AOC is obviously like a polarizing voice for a lot of people in the middle and certainly the right. So, I think the same way Democrats are going to use climate change to fundraise and gin up support among those really, the really progressive side of their party, it does the exact same thing for, the very conservative and Trump loyalists. Like it's a ton of money and it's, potentially unproven stuff, but just doesn't, in the current context, I just think that that's probably, it's a third rail, like a lot of other things, right? That probably, you can use it to stir it up, right?
Charles, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to echo something Sarah mentioned about the importance of COVID versus other things. Looking at our data, doing a statistical model, the strongest predictors of Trump vote are, of course, partisanship and his overall job approval. So, let's set that aside. But the next strongest is COVID performance. And the economy and protests are about half the effect that COVID has. And so if you think about Trump's strategies, one is emphasize the economy. That would certainly be the traditional campaign approach, and it's the area he has the highest rating on. Trump himself has emphasized protests in a negative way to complain about the protests, but both of those strategies are only having half the impact on vote choice that his COVID performance is having. So I think the strategies Sarah mentioned in the debate come through, but it also says these are the things that are dominant. Trying to bring in additional issues this late in the game, I think are less effective and do run the risk that Sarah's also mentioning, distracting from the main point. There are a lot of issues I keep going, why don't you guys talk about this? And smart strategists say, because we're focusing on the 1 or 2 big issues and we're not giving into that distraction.
So Charles, I have a data question. Is that analysis current, or is that, because I felt like just watching the news and watching the surveys sort of, especially around Kenosha, like around that time period, that I felt like Trump was really gaining ground during that time period. I think that a lot of people looked and said like Kenosha, Wisconsin, probably people who don't know Kenosha, Wisconsin, but thought, wow, that's not a place where we would normally expect to see the kinds of protests and really damaging protests where buildings were burnt down. I felt like that was a place where I felt like Trump was really gaining traction.
Absolutely. And the answer is the analysis I just reported is pooling multiple surveys. So I think it's solid that way. It includes the most recent survey. But with Kenosha, we had the good fortune that Trump visited halfway through our field period. So we could do a direct test. And this echoes what Emily was saying earlier. We did see a little bit of shift in opinion about protests and about his handling of them, but the gains all came with Republicans. They went from 60% approval before his visit to 80% after, but no movement of independents, and Democrats went down 2 points in approval. The result was a very small upturn in overall approval, but the shift was all concentrated among Republicans.
I was joking with the Pew Research fellow yesterday, Carroll Doherty, that the number one issue in the race appears to be Trump. Okay.
Amazing, isn't it?
Okay, so now we're going to wrap this up, and I have a lot of audience questions. I think you've heard them all about is polling accurate? What are you guys doing to make it more accurate? What happened in 2016 and we're not going to see now? So I'm going to go. I want to start with Ray Block from Penn State. And Ray, again, what groups polling sometimes misses people, right? Because they can't get to them, or the people won't go through the process. So how's polling doing? What's the state of polling these days? Let's start with Ray.
Well, as a person who really likes polling, I'll be very quick to say that I don't think polling is bad, right? I do believe, though, that the challenges that we saw with our last presidential election do force us to reconsider what it means to reach out to hard-to-reach groups. And the work that I do with the African American Research Collaborative does, in many ways, try to figure out how to find ways to get access to hard-to-reach groups. If I can drop some names, there are some people working at the National Conference for Black Political Scientists who are working on finding techniques that allow them to learn of the political preferences of rural African Americans, primarily because most of the story about rural people, like the urban-rural divide story, is typically about white rural residents. And we're trying to figure out what we can learn from what might not be a very large percentage of the African American electorate, but also a very important one, right? And so insofar as this election obviously is creating an opportunity to think about first-time voters coming into the process and thinking about how narratives about energizing traditionally not as likely to vote residents of this country is coming into play, I feel like it's really important that survey techniques figure out what's going on with those groups of people. I have a bias in the sense that I'm looking at racial and ethnic minorities with the work I do with Latino Decisions and with the African American Research Collaborative. But I think the general point is a good one. We know a lot more about white voters' preferences and potential behaviors than we do about other voters' preferences and potential behaviors.
So what can we do about that?
Culturally sensitive polling practices. Coming up, building relationships with vendors who have access to the people that you want to sample. Actually having language that reflects the dominant languages used by the people in the sample. Thinking very cleverly about how to get access to people that don't want you to have access to them, right? These are the kind of things that folks who are looking for information from racial and ethnic minorities have to do their work. But I think generally taking on these practices means you can cast a broader net.
Okay, Sarah Simmons, what's polling getting right and getting wrong, and how can it get better?
I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of what Ray said is totally right. How do we do smart things to reach out to people that are hard to reach for whatever reason? I think there's a bit of a turn towards also more in-person polling. I used to work with Harris Interactive, and we had a long-term relationship doing research with minority population and, along the Mexican border in Texas. And we had done it by phone for years and years. It was an elderly, largely Hispanic, some African-American population. And, we turned it into an in-person survey, in the last 5 years, because you just couldn't, there was no longer an ability to reach these people without sort of knocking on the door and being present. And I know, having done research across the world, you have to adjust to the place where you're doing the research. And we did, I designed a survey protocol for Albania, a secular Muslim country, but still, with a lot of very traditional practices. And, as we were designing it, somebody said, well, if two guys show up, they won't be able to interview a woman who's not married. That would never happen. You would never be able to talk to them. So we, readjusted and tried to figure out, okay, how do we do this so that there's some efficiency to what we're doing with in-person sampling, but it's sensitive, and we're being cognizant of those things. So I think just sort of opening our eyes to those practices. I also think like I have seen too many pollsters who are, too reluctant to weight data, to make models that are, worst case, middle case, best case scenario. I know that in 2008, when we were, doing John McCain's polling, we had a big team of really smart Republican pollsters, all of whom I respect and love, many of whom I, learned at their knees. And we had a big debate about how to judge what Black turnout would be. In what was going to clearly be a historic, monumental election cycle, and that's what we did. This is low, medium, high for Black turnout, and sort of trying to anticipate what those things might be, and not saying like, well, this is how God has done it, or this is the thing that matters most this time, and also really paying attention to how things are evolving. I mean, the point I made about it's been a decade since it's been hard to get young white men to answer a survey. And I think that all of that is just amplified in an environment where, you've got QAnon and, questions about whether or not people are following you on Facebook, and all these different sort of conspiracy-esque things for some of these folks that are, they're amplified in communities where there's, a lower percentage of college education. And I think that paying attention to that and trying to adjust and maybe not being so like, we're up 16, that's outside of the margin, like stamping it. That's not, being predictive in political polling is really important, but I also think being, cognizant that like, this is a really crazy time, and sort of building surveys that reflect that is really important.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Emily, what's the state of polling these days, and is there such a thing as a silent Trump voter?
All right, so two things. One, I think that I have been really pleased to see the recommitment of a lot of pollsters to doing polls in the states that, part of the problem in 2016 wasn't just that that the polls missed something. Certainly the national polls were actually pretty good in the final weeks of the campaign, but there weren't a whole lot of polls in the upper Midwest, in those states that ended up swinging the election for Trump. I've been really happy to see, for example, the polling that Barry's doing is an important commitment to that. There have been others who, especially in Wisconsin, and to a surprising extent, although a pleasing extent to me as a native Minnesotan in Minnesota, have been happy to see that not ignored by quite so many pollsters this year. I've been, I would like to still see more polls in Michigan. If anybody, out there has a state polling budget and wants to do polls in Michigan, seems like there are a few folks who are still a little bit shy about that. Not quite sure why. It does seem like some folks have committed themselves to doing more weighting by education. I'm not going to name names here, but I don't think that everybody has learned all of those lessons. I still talk to pollsters who will either say, I'm not doing any weighting at all, which gives me hives, or they're not waiting for education, or they know that that's what I'm going to ask about, and they say I am waiting for education, but also, I'm waiting for education and sex, and my first reaction is, what about age? What about race? Those are really important things too. And the one thing that we maybe missed last time around isn't the only thing that's important. Now that's everybody here, I think, is doing polling that takes all of those things into account, and there are a lot of really good pollsters right now operating in all of the states, but it is something that I still do hear from some of the pollsters who are operating in these states, which is concerning to me. In terms of the shy Trump vote, there was some attempt to figure out if that was part of what happened in 2016, and most of the research, I mean, it's hard to come to a firm conclusion, but most of the research tended to find that it wasn't such a big factor, that probably a bigger factor was that people broke late to Trump, as opposed to people not saying that they were, or people being reticent to tell us that they were going to vote for Trump. It goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier in terms of the depth of unpopularity. The number of people who said, I just don't like this guy, I have an unfavorable opinion of him, and who ended up voting for him. It might not have been a matter of being unwilling to tell us, but being sort of reticent to admit to themselves that that was who they were going to vote for. And I think that that's sort of the conclusion that most of the research that I've seen on this issue has come to. I think that to the extent that this may have been a problem in 2016, though, it might be even less of a problem now. And one reason why I say that is that if you compare unfavorable opinions of Trump in 2016 to unfavorable opinions now, he tends to actually do a little bit better now. I think some of those people who were on the fence about Trump have actually come to terms with him, and are, you know, he's still got net unfavorable ratings nationally and in many of these states, but the favorable opinions tend to be a little bit higher now than they were then. And that doesn't indicate to me that there's going to be a major problem with shy Trump voters this time around that there wasn't last time around, when, again, like in the final couple of weeks of the campaign, the margin actually narrowed dramatically and the national polls were only off by about a point. Yeah.
Okay, well, we got a few more minutes left, but I want to complete this circle here. Barry Burton from UW-Madison Elections Research Center. What about the state of polling these days? What are we getting right? What are we getting wrong?
Well, I agree that there isn't much evidence of a shy Trump effect. Studies have tried to uncover that and really have not found anything convincing to me that shows that was happening in any widespread way. For example, you might expect a difference between online polls and telephone polls. If people were afraid to reveal that they were supporting Trump, you'd see more of it in an anonymous online poll. There were pretty small differences between those two modes. And again, pretty small differences this year. I think a real challenge that you mentioned before is that the polling stops before Election Day, but the campaign continues. And so the polls can at best give you a snapshot of where things sit in late October. But we know in 2016, there was some late breaking movement, not enough to account for all of the misses by the state polls, but for some of it. This year, I think there's likely to be less of that. More people are saying they made up their minds. There are fewer undecideds. Heck, 5 or 6 million people have already voted, and many more are planning to in the coming weeks. And there are fewer third-party candidates who I think are attracting significant vote share. So there just isn't as much wiggle room for the polls to be off this year. And now Biden is hitting 50%, which is that magic number, or a little above it in some state and national polls, which puts, you know, they're just hard to imagine him losing enough to drop below, though it could happen. So I think some of it is just luck that the polls are going to likely be more accurate in the states this year because the dynamics are different. But each election cycle, there's something new that presents itself. Last time it was the education differential. This time it'll be something else. One thing I will say, the last 2 or 3 days have shown some national and state polls with Biden ahead by double digits, kind of eye-popping numbers from CNN and others. Those, I think, could be the result of what's known as differential responding, where the Democrats in the sample are just very excited to tell you they're Biden supporters and they like the momentum he has at the moment. That's likely to peel back a little bit in the coming days. But that's sort of the opposite of the shy Trump effect. So could be a little of that happening right now, but I think the polls are in a good place.
I also feel like there's fewer shy Trump voters. I feel like many more, you know, sort of, you've all alluded to this, but the people who are with Trump are really with him and they're very enthusiastic to tell you about it versus, you know, I think the breakaway Republicans last time were like, well, maybe we'll do the third part, you know, like, I don't know, and voting for Hillary, I think, was much more difficult for a lot of Republicans than, you know, the very likable Joe Biden, who's, you know, I think more of a, I think there's a lot of factors there, but much more, you know, positively viewed.
Charles, do you have any final words on the state of polling? You made some changes in the Marquette poll, and you were part of a study group after 2016. Do you think things have improved a lot?
Yeah, I want to take just a second to basically not repeat what everybody has said, because I want to associate myself with their remarks. I also want to specifically emphasize what Ray was saying about the African American Research Collaborative that he's part of and Latino Decisions. In a general purpose survey, it's very difficult to have substantial enough sample sizes or the kinds of things Ray was talking about language and accessibility and trust. And so to me, if this is the election in which we have done a lot more state polling collectively, and that's a great move forward. The things Ray is talking about of giving the kind of attention that's necessary to reach people of color. I'm going to put in Asian Americans in here to add to the list. These are not huge voting groups in most states, but they are important and growing population segments. And if we were going to invest the next dollars in survey research, I'm really inclined to follow the lead that Ray's setting here in those methods. So I got to put that on the table. I also want to agree with everybody else. I think having Barry doing polling here in the state is a terrific move, because it means we have another local guy doing this. It's great to have the Times and Fox and others coming through doing high quality polling as well. But what we want are domestic pollsters, if you will. And I think Barry's entry in this is just fantastic. I want to close with this. I do think there's all the reasons that have been mentioned about why we might be more confident this year. But I want to turn it to the political angle here. There was a salutary effect of us all being wrong, me being wrong, in that it proved that polling is not infallible, and voters and reporters and everyone is better served by not having developed this idea that any poll or the average of polls has to be the right answer. It doesn't. And so I think we're better citizens if we realize the burden lies on us to cast our votes and make the decisions, not to believe the polls are infallible. But I want to also flip that in the same way that fake news has become a terrific way to undermine negative press coverage of an incumbent administration. Likewise, the fact that the polls were wrong gives credibility to saying distrust everything the polling is showing you this year. Don't believe that Biden is up by 10 nationally or by 7 in Wisconsin or whatever the number is today. And so it takes a genuine failing of polling from 4 years ago to undermine trust in the technology and the science of polling, and in the process ignore the fact that in 2018, the polls here in Wisconsin were extremely accurate. We had the governor's race tied. It went by 1 point to the Democrat. We had the Senate race at 11, and it was 10.9. And that's the same technology basically as we used before. To answer specifically Jeff's question, we've tweaked things a little bit. If someone says they're undecided, we now push them a little bit. Well, if you had to vote, how would you vote? Guess what's happening this time? Dead even split between the two when we push, and over 60% that still say, no, I'm not decided. So it's starting out not to be a magic bullet. But anyway, I think the broader point is, if we put on our science hats, we would say there's a lot of reason to believe the polling this time, that the errors in 2016 were more idiosyncratic rather than systemic failures of polling. We heard a lot about polling being broken, but I think on balance, the evidence even then with national data is it's not broken. And in 18, we mostly had good performance, Missouri and Indiana being the two prime examples where we did have errors, but Wisconsin worked pretty well. So bottom line is, it may be very smart political strategy to play on the uncertainty from 16 and to undermine all the bad news right now that's coming out from the Trump administration's point of view. It's an effective strategy. And in the end, I think we'd all just do well to urge voters to go out and vote or send in their ballots or go to the polls early.
Okay, well, we're run out of time, but I have this one final question, and you're just going to raise your hand. So you're ready? It's like a game show. Are we going to know who won? Are we going to know who won on the morning of November 4th in the presidential race? Who says yes? Raise your hand. Wow.
Oh, getting out there on the edge here. Come on, guys.
I don't think this. I think the 2-week stuff is crazy. Like I don't believe that. But I will. I do remember in 2000, sitting in Madison, not knowing who won Wisconsin, right? And calling. I don't remember what poor clerk I called at 3 a.m. when someone finally dragged me away from a phone, and I said, "The whole country's waiting for you. What do you mean you're at home?" So I don't know. I think it's not going to be 2 weeks. I do think that it might be a little murky the morning after.
Okay,
Yeah.
Charles, you're hanging out there in my poll. You're only one of 5. Okay, well that concludes us for today. This has been really fascinating. It's been a lot of fun. You are all great panelists, and maybe we'll reconvene this at another point. We can dissect the race maybe after. So thank you, Charles, with the Marquette University Law School poll. Ray Block, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Department of African American Studies at Penn State. Emily Swanson, Director of Public Opinion Research for the Associated Press. Barry Burton, the Director of UW-Madison Elections Research Center. And Sarah Simmons of Purple Strategies. Thank to you all. Thank you, audience. We'll be sending out links and the video of this to all of you a little bit later. So that concludes the WisPolitics Second Annual Midwest Polling Summit of October 8th and 9th. Virtually this year, hopefully back in our room next year where we can all network. And I want to thank our sponsors, of course, AARP Wisconsin and the Outrider Foundation. Thank you to Sam Wilson of AARP Wisconsin and to Tia Nelson of the Outrider Foundation. You can find out more about WisPolitics events coming up at wispolitics.com. So thanks, everybody. Make sure you go vote. Stay safe. Take care. This is Jeff Maris signing off.